In 2013, a shocking discovery inside Michigan's prison kitchens forced the state to confront the dark side of its prison food system. Inspectors, conducting routine checks, stumbled upon something that most people would associate with a horror movie: maggots inside food that was meant to nourish incarcerated individuals. It wasn't just a one-off incident, it was part of a broader, systemic failure. Potatoes riddled with maggots, oatmeal crawling with insects, and meat that seemed far from fresh. This discovery would eventually ignite a national debate about the consequences of privatizing prison food services and whether profit motives were prioritizing cost over human dignity. Before this scandal, few knew just how badly things were going behind the prison kitchen doors. For years, Michigan had contracted with Aramark, a major food service company, to manage meals for thousands of inmates across the state's prison system. Aramark was supposed to provide nutritious meals that met the dietary needs of prisoners, but instead, reports from inmates, workers, and health inspectors revealed a disturbing pattern of unsanitary conditions. The problems weren't just isolated to Michigan. They would soon spread to Ohio and other states, making it clear that this wasn't a one-time mistake but a recurring issue. The Aramark scandal was more than just about spoiled food. It was about the systematic failure to care for a vulnerable population in one of the most neglected environments in the country. Inmates began to speak out, and what they revealed would send shockwaves throughout the country. Some prisoners reported seeing food that was weeks past its expiration date. Others said that the meat they were served often looked or smelled like it had been stored improperly, sitting in unsanitary conditions for far too long. But it didn't stop there. The media began to cover the story, and soon, investigations revealed that the maggot-infested food wasn't a fluke. It had been happening for months, even years, but the authorities had failed to act. Some prison employees were found to be falsifying safety logs to cover up the unsanitary conditions, making it impossible for auditors to get an accurate picture of what was really happening. Inmates who spoke out were often punished or ignored. It became clear that something had gone seriously wrong in Michigan's prison kitchens. In the wake of these discoveries, Michigan was forced to cancel its $145 million food service contract with Aramark. The company, which had been tasked with feeding thousands of prisoners, was fined more than $200,000 for repeated violations. But the damage was done. The scandal had already exposed a broken system, one where inmates were treated as little more than numbers, their basic needs ignored in favor of cost-cutting measures. The real question that emerged was how something like this could happen in the first place. How could an industry that was supposed to provide for the most vulnerable in society allow such atrocities to take place? The privatization of prison food services, in which companies like Aramark made profits by cutting costs and reducing quality, seemed to be at the heart of the issue. For the people who had been affected, the revelation of maggots in their meals was just one symptom of a much larger problem. While Michigan was in the headlines, the issues didn't stop there. The same problems began to crop up in Ohio's prisons, where prisoners staged food refusals after discovering worms in their meals. The common thread was clear: privatized food services were consistently failing to meet basic health standards, and inmates were paying the price. The private companies responsible for these failures had little incentive to improve, as they were often more concerned with maximizing profits than with the well-being of those they were contracted to serve. But the scandals didn't end with Michigan and Ohio. Investigative reports from outlets like the Detroit Free Press began to dig deeper into the issue, revealing even more disturbing practices. It turned out that Aramark wasn't just failing to serve safe food. They were also reusing leftovers, forcing prisoners to eat food that had been scraped from previous meals, reheated, and served again. This practice wasn't just unsanitary, it was a violation of basic human rights. Reusing food in this way put prisoners at risk of foodborne illnesses and made them even more vulnerable to exploitation. It wasn't just the quality of the food that was an issue. The entire system of privatized prison food service seemed designed to keep costs as low as possible, regardless of the consequences. Inmates were often served small portions, sometimes missing key nutrients necessary for their health. Meals were frequently unbalanced, lacking the vitamins and minerals needed to sustain those who were already suffering in an environment designed to break their spirit. This issue was particularly troubling for inmates with special dietary needs, including those with diabetes or other health conditions. The public outcry grew louder as the investigations continued, but the issue remained deeply entrenched. Michigan's decision to sever ties with Aramark didn't lead to an immediate overhaul of the entire system. The company was still allowed to operate in other states, and the privatization of prison food service continued unabated. It was clear that as long as companies could profit from the exploitation of incarcerated people, these problems would persist. But there was hope. The revelation sparked a national debate on the ethics of privatizing prison services, including food. Activists, lawyers, and human rights organizations began to push back against the system, demanding better conditions for prisoners and accountability from the companies responsible. In the years that followed, several states began to re-evaluate their contracts with food service providers, and some even moved to bring food services back under state control. The Maggots scandal in Michigan was more than just a wake-up call. It was a turning point in the national conversation about the treatment of incarcerated individuals. It showed the world just how far the system had gone in its disregard for the basic needs of those in prison, and it revealed the lengths to which private companies would go to maximize profits at the expense of human lives. The question remained, how much longer would society allow this to continue? Would the pressure from activists and the public be enough to spark real change? As the story unfolds, the truth becomes clear. The issues in Michigan's prisons were not isolated, nor were they unique to the state. The problem was much larger, and it was rooted in a system that prioritized profit over people. What began as a discovery of maggots in prison food would become a battle for the rights and dignity of incarcerated people across the United States. And the fight was just beginning. The impact of the maggot scandal didn't stop at Michigan. It reverberated across the country, exposing the hidden horrors of the privatized prison food system. In the aftermath of the discovery, state governments were forced to confront the fact that they had handed over the care of thousands of incarcerated individuals to profit-driven companies whose interests often conflicted with their responsibility to maintain basic standards of human dignity. As national media outlets like the Detroit Free Press and the New York Times began covering the scandal, they revealed a much larger pattern of corruption and negligence within the prison food service industry. The issues weren't just limited to maggots or worms in the food, but included systemic violations that endangered the health and safety of prisoners across multiple states. In Michigan, the public outrage was palpable. Inmates who had previously kept silent about the conditions in prison kitchens began to speak out, sharing their disturbing experiences. One former prisoner described the food he was served as unfit for any living being, recounting how meals often looked like they had been left to rot before being reheated and distributed to the population. The reports were chilling, with inmates revealing how food that was past its expiration date was often served as if it were fresh, and how kitchen staff regularly falsified hygiene logs to cover up the unsanitary conditions. State audits, conducted in the wake of the scandal, uncovered shocking discrepancies. According to a 2014 report, Michigan prison kitchens had a history of food safety violations, including failed inspections and repeated contamination incidents. The state's response to these findings was telling. Michigan's Department of Corrections, already facing immense pressure, terminated its contract with Aramark, a decision that would send a message across the country about the risks of privatizing critical services like food in correctional institutions. However, the problem didn't end with Aramark's ousting. The state's attempt to shift food services back to public control was fraught with its own set of issues. Without the necessary infrastructure, the state struggled to maintain the food quality required to meet the needs of its prison population. Many of the same problems persisted, including inadequate nutrition, irregular meal times, and portions that were insufficient for the inmates' energy demands. It became clear that Michigan's prisons were underfunded and understaffed, and privatization had been the easy route to cut costs, but now they were facing the long-term consequences of that choice. Across the country, Ohio became the next battleground in this war over prison food. In 2014, just a year after the Michigan scandal, Ohio prisoners staged protests after worms were discovered in their meals. The response from the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction was almost identical to that of Michigan. Excuses, finger-pointing, and minimal action. It wasn't until prisoners refused to eat that the issue gained national attention. The protests, although small, were enough to bring the horror of subpar prison meals into the national spotlight once again. But like Michigan, Ohio didn't take immediate action. Instead, state officials attempted to downplay the severity of the situation, citing the challenges of managing a prison system with limited funds. The Ohio protests were a direct response to the growing tension between inmates and the privatized companies responsible for feeding them. For many incarcerated people, food had become a battleground for their rights. As one inmate explained during a recorded interview, "They're starving us and they want to make money off it." That simple statement summed up the feeling that many prisoners had. They weren't just being mistreated, they were being commodified. Their hunger was a business opportunity, and the longer they went without proper meals, the more profitable the food service contracts became for the companies involved. Meanwhile, the discovery of maggots and worms wasn't just an isolated occurrence. Investigations conducted by watchdog groups revealed that the same issues had cropped up in prisons across the country. In Pennsylvania, food service complaints reached a peak in 2015 when inmates reported moldy bread and rancid milk being served as part of their meals. In Kentucky, food safety violations were so severe that the state's Auditor General intervened, demanding an immediate overhaul of the system. Across the country from Texas to California, similar stories began to emerge, each detailing food contamination, foodborne illnesses, and a disregard for basic hygiene. As this nationwide crisis unfolded, public opinion began to shift. The debate surrounding privatized prison food services grew more intense, with many advocating for a complete overhaul of the system. Activists, along with several public officials, began to question the ethical implications of privatizing prison services, arguing that the profit motive inherently compromised the quality of care provided to inmates. While the companies involved, like Aramark and its competitors, defended their actions, stating that they were working within the constraints of their contracts and budgets, many saw their arguments as excuses. The public outrage sparked political action. In 2016, Michigan's state legislature called for hearings to investigate the practices of Aramark and other private contractors, but the hearings were largely symbolic. The political will to make lasting changes was weak, as lawmakers feared the consequences of completely dismantling the privatized prison system, which had become an integral part of the state's budget. At the same time, grassroots movements across the country began pushing back against what they saw as a privatization system that exploited prisoners for profit. Organizations like the Prison Policy Initiative and the ACLU led campaigns to demand better food conditions and to pressure state governments to return food services to public hands. They argued that food was a basic human right, not something to be treated as a commodity to be sold at the lowest possible cost. The Michigan scandal, while terrible, had also catalyzed a conversation about the rights of incarcerated people and their treatment within the system. It was no longer just about maggots in food, it was about the treatment of human beings within a system that was supposed to rehabilitate them. But for every story of reform and change, there were many more instances where the issue went unaddressed. Even as some states moved to retake control of prison food services, the inherent flaws of the prison system remained. And as long as profit-driven motives continued to shape the way prisoners were treated, the food issues were only the beginning of a much larger crisis. The scandal's aftermath served as a stark reminder of the price of profit over people, but it also ignited a national conversation about the inhumane conditions many prisoners endure. As states across the country began to grapple with these issues, one thing became painfully clear. The way food was served in prison was just a symptom of a much deeper systemic problem. It was no longer enough to simply focus on food, the entire prison industrial complex needed reform. As the investigations and public outcry continued to grow, the Michigan scandal and its ripple effects began to shift the way Americans viewed the treatment of incarcerated individuals, particularly when it came to the food they were served. In the years that followed, activists, journalists, and human rights organizations kept the pressure on, demanding accountability from both the private contractors and the government agencies responsible. But even as public awareness of the problem increased, so did the pushback from those who had benefited from the privatization of prison services. In Michigan, after Aramark's contract was terminated, the state began exploring ways to fix the broken prison food system. But the challenges were not as simple as just firing a contractor. Michigan's prisons were in a state of disrepair, and the systems that managed food services were just as neglected as the rest of the facilities. Attempts to bring food services back under state control were hindered by the same budget constraints that had initially driven the state to outsource the task in the first place. The truth was, Michigan's Department of Corrections simply didn't have the infrastructure or resources to handle the vast logistics of feeding tens of thousands of incarcerated people. To make matters worse, Michigan wasn't the only state grappling with this issue. As the story of the maggot-filled meals in Michigan gained national attention, a wave of similar revelations began to surface across the United States. In Ohio, just a year after the Michigan scandal, more instances of unsanitary prison kitchens and subpar food came to light. Despite protests from inmates, the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction did little to address the root causes of these problems. Once again, the focus seemed to be more on containing the public relations damage than fixing the systemic issues that had caused these abuses in the first place. Meanwhile, investigations revealed even deeper flaws within the privatized food system. In several states, including Michigan and Ohio, it was revealed that companies like Aramark routinely recycled leftover food. Inmates described how meals from the previous day were simply reheated and served again, sometimes after being stored improperly. This not only posed serious health risks but also exposed the growing disregard for prisoners' health and well-being in the pursuit of profit. The use of recycled food wasn't just an occasional mistake, it was a systemic practice. The revelations about recycled food and unsanitary kitchens led to a further deterioration of public trust in the prison system. Critics of privatization argued that profit-driven motives would always result in corner-cutting and neglect. As long as private companies were being paid to provide food, their primary concern would always be the bottom line, not the well-being of the people they were contracted to serve. For many advocates, the issue was not just about bad food but the broader question of the prison industrial complex. How could the state justify profiting off the backs of incarcerated people? How could they allow companies to cut corners on something as basic as food, a necessity for survival, while receiving millions of dollars in government contracts? Public outcry over the issue began to gain momentum, especially in the wake of the Ohio and Michigan scandals. National organizations such as the American Civil Liberties Union (ACLU), the Prison Policy Initiative, and the Center for Constitutional Rights began to take up the cause, demanding that prison food services be returned to public control. Their arguments were clear. Privatization of prison services, especially something as essential as food, had failed. The public interest was being neglected in favor of corporate profits. However, the fight was far from easy. Even though public pressure was mounting, lawmakers and government officials were hesitant to make major changes. For some, privatization had become deeply entrenched in the prison system. They argued that the private sector could provide services more efficiently and at a lower cost. But the facts from Michigan and Ohio were hard to ignore. Privatization had led to dangerous food contamination, exploitation, and neglect. The true cost of privatizing prison services wasn't just financial, it was paid in human lives, the dignity of incarcerated people, and the safety of prison populations. In 2017, after years of public outcry, Michigan finally made the decision to end privatized food services entirely. The state took back control with the goal of running its own kitchen operations and providing better quality food to inmates. But despite this victory, the problem was far from solved. The state struggled with staffing issues, training, and the resources necessary to improve the food system. It quickly became apparent that the state's attempts to fix the food issue were just a band-aid on a much larger problem. The deeper issue was the overcrowded, understaffed, and underfunded nature of the prison system itself. While Michigan took steps to remedy the food scandal, other states, including Ohio and Pennsylvania, continued to rely on private companies to manage prison kitchens. Even in the face of ongoing scandals, these states found it difficult to sever ties with the private contractors. Companies like Aramark continued to win contracts in other states, despite their well-documented history of violations. The contracts were lucrative, and the demand for cheap prison labor, which often provided the backbone of these food systems, was too great for some state lawmakers to ignore. This led to a continuing cycle of abuse that plagued the prison food system. As the years passed, more state-level investigations began to show that the issue wasn't just about food, it was about the entire prison system. A growing number of reform advocates began to argue that the problems with food were merely a reflection of broader systemic issues, including overcrowding, abuse, and inadequate medical care. For many prisoners, the lack of proper nutrition was just one of many indignities they faced. From lack of access to education to substandard health care, the conditions in many of the nation's prisons were in dire need of reform. The campaign for prison food reform grew into a wider call for prison reform in general. Activists pushed for greater transparency, better oversight, and more accountability from the companies involved in the prison industrial complex. The issue of privatized prison food was just the tip of the iceberg in the fight for human dignity behind bars. For many, it was about recognizing that incarcerated people, regardless of their crimes, were human beings who deserved the same basic rights and treatment as anyone else. The Maggots scandal, while shocking and disturbing, had ignited a firestorm of change. It forced the country to reckon with the ways in which its prisons were treating the most vulnerable members of society. It showed that when profit is prioritized over humanity, the consequences can be disastrous. And while the struggle for reform was far from over, the conversation had been shifted. The demand for a fairer, more humane prison system, one that respected the dignity of all individuals, whether behind bars or not, was louder than ever. In the end, the fight for better prison food was part of a larger struggle for justice, accountability, and basic human dignity. The question remained, Would the lessons learned from these scandals be enough to finally reform the prison system? Or would the story of rotten meals and maggots continue to be just another chapter in the long history of America's broken prison system? As the nation continued to wrestle with the fallout from the prison food scandals, the question remained: could the United States fix its broken prison system, or would these revelations be buried under layers of bureaucracy and corporate interests? The issue of maggot-infested meals had captured the public's attention, but it was clear that the problem wasn't limited to unsanitary kitchens or spoiled food. The entire system that incarcerated people existed in had deep, systemic flaws. The food scandal was just one manifestation of a larger crisis, one that stretched far beyond the prison walls and into the very fabric of the criminal justice system. In the wake of Michigan's decision to cut ties with Aramark, many believed that it would set a precedent for other states to follow suit. Michigan's experiment with public food services showed that it was possible to take back control from private contractors. However, the state's struggle to effectively manage food services highlighted a larger issue: the need for comprehensive prison reform. Simply bringing food services under public control wasn't enough to address the root causes of the abuse. The problem lay in the structure itself: overcrowded prisons, underpaid and overworked staff, and the profit-driven motives of private companies that were hired to provide services like food, healthcare, and transportation. For many advocates, the food issue was merely a starting point for the larger fight for justice in America's prisons. The prison industrial complex, they argued, was designed to exploit both prisoners and taxpayers. Private corporations were thriving off the backs of those incarcerated, often cutting corners to maximize profits while sacrificing safety, human dignity, and basic rights. The scandal surrounding Aramark's food services was just one of many examples of how the system had failed to protect those in its care. National organizations like the ACLU, the Prison Policy Initiative, and grassroots movements across the country began to focus not just on the food issue, but on the entire prison system. They argued that the problem was not just about maggots in the oatmeal, it was about how the prison system treated people regardless of their crimes. The movement was pushing for broader reforms, including better healthcare, mental health services, educational opportunities, and a re-evaluation of sentencing laws that led to overcrowding in the first place. At the core of these reforms was the belief that prisons should aim to rehabilitate, not just punish. But the road to reform was filled with obstacles. Despite the growing public outcry over the poor conditions in America's prisons, lawmakers and politicians remained largely indifferent. The political and financial power of the private prison industry was immense, and any serious attempt at reform was met with fierce resistance. Those who benefited from the current system, from private contractors to law enforcement unions, fought to maintain the status quo. For many, prison reform was too controversial, too politically charged to tackle head-on. As a result, the calls for change often seemed to fall on deaf ears. The U.S. prison system continued to operate as it always had: inefficiently, inhumanely, and profit-driven. While individual cases of abuse like the Aramark scandal were exposed in the media, systemic change remained elusive. The reforms that were being proposed were often incremental at best, and in many cases, they were watered down or delayed for political reasons. The battle for better prison food was just one aspect of a larger fight to transform the criminal justice system, but it had brought the issue to the forefront of the national conversation. For the first time, Americans were forced to confront the reality of how their prison system operated. They were forced to reckon with the fact that the people behind bars, whether they were serving sentences for minor offenses or more serious crimes, were still human beings who deserved respect, dignity, and basic rights. The idea that profit could come at the expense of human lives was a concept that more and more people were beginning to reject. In the years that followed, the stories of poor food, contaminated meals, and inhumane treatment of prisoners continued to surface. While some states made efforts to address the issue, the fight for true reform was far from over. The challenges were daunting: how to overhaul a system that had become so deeply entrenched in American society. How to push back against the corporate interests that profited from the suffering of incarcerated people. Despite these challenges, the fight for reform persisted. Advocacy groups pushed for more transparency in prison contracts, better oversight of food services, and more accountability from private contractors. They demanded that states invest in prison systems that focused on rehabilitation, not just punishment. They argued that by treating prisoners with dignity and respect, the system would produce better outcomes for everyone, from the incarcerated individuals to society at large. The prison food scandals had ignited a conversation that could no longer be ignored. The public had seen the evidence: maggots in food, unsanitary kitchens, recycled meals, it was all part of a much larger problem. Now, the question was whether the US government would listen. Would it take the necessary steps to fix a system that was broken from the inside out? As long as the profit-driven motives of private companies remained at the heart of the prison system, these abuses were likely to continue. But there was hope. The conversation had started. People were no longer willing to accept the status quo. The stories of maggot-filled meals, while disturbing, were just the beginning of a much larger reckoning. And if the American public could continue to demand change, perhaps this dark chapter in the country's prison history could finally come to an end. What do you think? Have we seen the end of the prison food scandal, or is it just the beginning of a much larger fight for prison reform? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story shocked you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay informed on the latest in true crime, prison documentaries, and the hidden world behind bars. As always, thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.